like I said, you'll see me. I don't always look at you while you're answering the question, and I tend to be like, taking a big picture, getting into stuff, going like this to make sure it's still in focus, make sure your gestures are working, make sure the thing hasn't run out of tape. Now, is it accurate that you were involved in dial-up BBSes in the early 80s?
Well, as a user, certainly. Started using BBSs around probably 1982. Yeah, it was 1982 because I picked up the Alias Digital Man then, and that was right after the Rush album Signals came out. So.
Now, I mean, what was your hardware platform?
Apple II, Apple IIe, Apple II Plus.
What kind of modem?
Apple Cat.
Yeah. You want to talk? I mean, did you take advantage of all the features of the Apple Cat?
Actually, it was my brother's computer. I didn't actually own my own computer until I was 18, and that was an IBM compatible PC XT. So my brother knew more about computers than I did back then, and I'm not all sure. I think I think you're asking if we did any like box work with it.
Well, there's box work. The Apple Cat could do music.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, he did. We did play music through it. Yeah. Oh, and he also had some like voice synthesis. We used to like crank call people where you could type in things and it would do the synthetic computer voice. So those were pretty fun.
Yeah. So I mean, in the beginning you're already having fun. I mean, which in '82, your choices of BBSs are relatively limited.
Yeah, I think.
What can you remember among the first BBSs you stumble onto?
I think as far as software goes, they were all running GBBS. I didn't run a BBS back then, but I think all the BBSs that I used were that were on Apple anyway were GBBS. There were PC BBSs, and they all seemed very stale. I used a couple, and then there was like a CompuMate. I think that was like some custom Unix software that I remember. But those were pretty stale. The most fun BBSs were the Apple BBSs, and I think they were all GBBS.
What about GBBS is fun?
Well, they had like animated prompts and things. I don't remember if they were color or not, but they'd have like you could do like non-destructive backspaces to do like spinning cursors and things. So you could, at the end of your messages, you could have it, spell out your name in backspace and spell something else, and that was that was fun about it back then. Nowadays, a spinning or a non-destructive backspace goes by so fast you can't even tell what it was originally printing.
Yeah, the only place I see a spinning cursor anymore is during a Sun Solaris boot up process.
Yeah.
That's about it. I mean, did you stay with 300 for long?
Oh, 300 baud?
Yeah.
I don't remember the details. I was like 12 years old, so it was so long ago. I don't remember. I think we actually had a 1200 baud modem at that time.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Apple Cat could do 1200, but only in certain situations.
Yeah. I don't recall like whether we used it for. I don't remember which rates we connected to which boards, and sometimes they just did file transfers.
Was there any bulletin board in that time that you connected to it? You said, like, it's one thing to connect to it, and bulletin boards are neat, but it's another thing when you connect to one where you're just like, well, this is why they have these.
Well, they were all fascinating to me then, but certainly the more interesting ones were, like I said, running on Apple, and there was one in particular called the Beast Domain. That was run by a guy who had fun with his users. Sometimes you'd call in and it would be it'd be this fake no-rad security system that you'd as a curious user you'd try to hack into it, and it was all kind of war games esque. It was one of those fun things, but it was also Gunslinger, the Roadhouse. The sysop was called Gunslinger. And that was a pretty big BBS back then. I think he had like 5 megabytes of storage, and that was a big deal back then.
Now, War Games comes out in June of '83.
Mm-hmm.
Did that change anything for you?
No, not really. I think it was one of those things where even back then I laughed at the movie, and said, "Oh, that's so unrealistic. Computers don't do that, or they don't do this, or some of it was kind of like feeling like your little secret world has been somewhat exposed, but it was done in such an unrealistic way that it wasn't flattering. At least I didn't feel like it was flattering, and I felt like I was part of such a this underground movement. I mean, here we are, we're emailing, we're sending files and games and pirating software and whatever, and 9 out of 10 people have no idea what you're talking about if you bring it up.
For most people now, when they think of pirated software, it's all very. In some cases, it's almost mechanical, and sometimes it has an almost commercial feel to it. But do you sense a different attitude with the Apple II pirating? Is there a different feel to how they go about it or went about it?
Uh, there was such a big deal to get like a single game back then. A lot of times you'd have to connect with somebody directly, and you'd say you'd work it out ahead of time where I'm going to send you this game and you'd send me another game, and it was just like most of the times you get the game and you didn't like it anyway, and and the transfers took so long, especially at 300 baud, that I don't think it was nearly as prolific as it is, and I don't think the games sold for nearly as much as they did, and there wasn't as much time put into them as there is now. So, I don't think it was as valuable, of an asset. Whereas today, people pirate games that people work on for years and years, and they sell for, pretty pretty high dollar amounts. So, and they're so widely distributed now. So it's kind of a different era, and it's a different, um, it's a different thing that they're trading, even though there's still games or applications. They're so much bigger now and higher dollar.
So, how long do you remain a user before you decide you want a piece of running it or writing one?
Well, when my brother moved away, I was about 15. I didn't have a computer of my own, so I really just kind of stopped using computers. I would use the computers at school occasionally and get in trouble, but still Apples at this time. And but as far as using BBSs, I had no access really. And it wasn't until I graduated high school that my brother and my dad pitched in together and got me an IBM compatible XT. They actually started a small computer store up in Northern California. So to them, building and selling computers was now their business, and that's really what rejuvenated the whole computer interest with me, was when I got that PC.
You get the PC, and the PC, when you get it brand new and it's nice and big and tough and gray, did you have any, did you sense a different feeling in the culture from when you had left it off to when you started up again?
Well, initially when I got the computer, there really was no culture. I mean, I just got the computer and I got some games, and it was just kind of me playing with the computer and the games. But I never really, aside from maybe the Sierra games like the Space Quest and King's Quest, like those games, I really never really got into games too much. And I certainly was more interested in the whole modem thing. So it wasn't too long before I got a modem and started getting on BBSs. And certainly I noticed that things were much faster at 2400 baud, and things were in color, and we had archive formats. This was kind of around the time of the old .arc to .zip transition, and these nifty file transfer protocols like ZModem. So things had changed technology-wise. I don't think things had changed too much attitude-wise. It wasn't too long before I started my own BBS using WWIV BBS software, and a user logged on my board, and I recognized his handle, and it was the sysop of the beast domain that I had mentioned earlier, and he too had gotten a PC around the same time I had, and he started running BBS, and so it's kind of the old Apple guys kind of getting back together again in this new era of the PC.
Your brother mentions Diversitals. Did you ever play a part or be in those?
No, the name sounds familiar, but I don't remember what the technology was. Or
Okay, no problem.
yeah, he was more into the Apple thing because it was his. I had to sneak into his room at night to use it.
Well, Diversitals were the multi-line chat.
Oh yeah.
You had,
No,
like,
I didn't.
Flash,
Yeah,
private, and
yeah, I didn't use those.
and they often cost money because they were so expensive. I think
Yeah.
it was like $1,600 to get the software and the card.
Wow.
So they had to charge money to be able to afford it.
Yeah.
You know, why did you choose World War IV?
Because that's what the BBSs I were calling in the local area were running. They were running that, and it was freely downloadable, and it wasn't too hard to get the source code. Because the kind of modifications I wanted to make. Well, initially I was really afraid of the source code because I didn't really know how to program anything but BASIC, and I really hadn't done that in years either. But after I got into the source code, I realized all the areas of improvement that it needed, and it wasn't too long before I decided to write my own.
So instead of just patching it, perhaps you decided that you just wanted to start over?
Well, I did patch it. I did quite a bit of modifications to WWIV. I made it multi-node compatible. I added support for bidirectional file transfers. I put in multi-node chat. And for a good year, maybe year and a half, I was like the only multi-node WWIV out there. And people would constantly hound me for my modifications. They'd ask me, oh, give me this and give me that. It was too difficult to just separate my modifications. And plus, I knew all the problems. There was these theoretical problems with, too many people on would crash the database because it wasn't designed for multiple simultaneous user access. So, I didn't feel that good about it because it was built on a flimsy, deck of cards to begin with. So I didn't give out my modifications to WWIV, and that's when I just decided to start from scratch. It'd be much easier.
Back then or now, what was your opinion of the World War IV source code?
The source code?
Yeah.
Is pathetic. It's some of the worst C code I've ever seen in my life. And, at the time, it was the first C code I'd ever seen in my life. So I didn't know any different. When I first, looked at it, I didn't understand, what I was looking at. And the first modification I made didn't compile, and I had no idea why. But, from then on, as I learned more about the programming language and got into, programming my own projects, I realized just how bad the source code was. It was actually originally converted using a conversion program from Pascal to C. And it's obvious in hindsight looking at the code because there was all these typecasts and unnecessary things that were put in the code that no human would ever type all these things since they weren't necessary to begin with, and all they did was obfuscate the source code. So it made it very difficult to understand or modify. I can stop that.
That's okay.
It's just a CD changer.
Oh, it's okay. I just calmly wondered what it was
Yeah.
making that noise. I figured a cat stuck.
No.
Now, what was pathetic about the source code, I assume, was the obfuscation. Was the flow? Did the flow make sense? Did other parts of it make sense to you?
No, not really. Yeah, there were very few comments. The names of variables and functions were almost purposely. It almost seemed like they were purposely misleading. It was like they had functions like do it and do it one and do it two, You're like, what does this do? What? And variable names like x1 and II2. I mean, they make no sense. So it's very difficult to read to begin with. And then when you actually follow the logic, no, it was a real challenge. It was definitely not something that could be considered of professional quality.
So why do you think it becomes so popular?
Because it was the only BBS software with free source code. Or not free, obviously. It's not supposed to be free. But it was the only BBS software where the source code was available, and it was somewhat feature rich.
At that point, certainly. Well, actually, no, that's wrong. Certainly, from the days of even GBBS, there's a strong modding culture. I mean, GBBS people are modifying their stuff.
Right. You had to. I mean, to configure the thing, you had to modify the source code. So yeah, if you go back to the Apple era, then yeah, everything is pretty much available in source code as far as BBSs go.
Right, but even beyond it being available, people are actively modding them, putting up mods, and that trips us over to the World War IV software as well, and many others. But from your point of view, as someone who modded and then later developed his own, what's the draw?
What's the attraction?
Yeah, to do that.
Well, for me, when I first started with WWIV, I was not a programmer, or at least certainly not a C programmer. And so to start with something from scratch to begin with, I would have no interest. I wouldn't even know where to begin. So I certainly learned some things from looking at the C code originally. Just learned, what a printf does. Unfortunately, I had to unlearn many of the things I learned from looking at the C code because it was so bad. But at least it was something to start with. It wasn't too difficult to add the things I wanted to do without having to worry about all the other basics that had already been taken care of, the serial communications and displaying colors or whatever the issues were. So it's a lot easier to start with something that's already there. Of course, when you get serious about it, that's when you have to deal with the limitations of the original design. But I can understand, people wanting to modify source code. Luckily now, or certainly even with other BBS packages at the time, you could do very high levels of modification without needing the source code. Certainly scripted BBSs, where you have access to the script source code, or you can write your own scripts. You could do as much or more with those BBS packages that you could have done with WWIV with access to the source code.
And what was initially your motivation to write your own BBS instead of just continuing to use what was out there?
Well, I had a very popular BBS, and there was no way that one phone line or even 2 or 3 was enough. I really wanted to run at least a 4-node BBS, and WWIV was just not multi-node capable. That was probably the biggest feature that was missing. I had made modifications to make it so I could run multiple nodes, but really reliably I couldn't run more than 2 nodes. There were just too many problems with the databases, primarily with the databases. But I had also done some other projects with doing multiple user access over local area networks. At the time, a single PC really wasn't really powerful enough to handle more than one user. A desk view was not really predominant. We're still talking about XTs and 286s here. So, the idea was, I knew a lot about doing local area networks by that time, and I really wanted to run at least 4 PCs, all accessing the same databases, and each PC handling a simultaneous user, and plus the features that go along with that, like multi-node chat. And multi-user games, things like that. I really kind of wanted to build on the whole idea of having multiple users.
So the question comes, are you charging people to use your BBS? We'll go into the programming process.
Yeah.
After it's programmed and it's up, do you charge?
Oh, I never charged people to use my BBS, no.
Why not? You've done all this work, you created the system, why not charge?
Well, it was a hobby. It was, when I first put up my BBS. My BBS Vertrauen, as it was named, first went up in 1988, and at first I just kind of had the same files that everybody else had, and then I really got into collecting GIF files. So I had I don't know, at least 100 megabytes in GIFs, and after a while, I had the biggest hard drive in town. I spent $1,500 on a 330 megabyte drive, and you could put all these GIF files on there, and a lot of them were pornographic, and it was very popular. But my interest really was more in the software. I mean, this is kind of what happened. Was my interest was more in developing the software rather than trying to make a business out of it. It was just I had fun programming. So to me, those were the challenges. I saw a lot of potential. I saw a lot of things that could be done that hadn't, or maybe they had, but not in a way that I would like them to be done. So, I just saw it more of a programming challenge. And the more users that were using my BBS, the better, because they were testing my software for me for free.
But at this point, I mean, with 4 nodes and 4 computers, your BBS is costing you quite a bit.
Not too bad. No, it really wasn't. It was... And I could justify anything for the fun of the hobby. At the time I had my own. At this time, I had a computer company where I was building and selling computers and installing local area networks. So I kind of justified it as being part of business expenses, and I had plenty of computer parts, always. So the PCs were basically like inventory, so it was free for that respect. The phone lines, they were cheaper then, certainly, than they are now. I think there was my total phone bill was never over $100 at that time. It built from there. After I created Synchronet and I was able to build lots of nodes, I got up to 8 nodes at one time.
Okay, so your maximum was 8 lines.
I believe so. It was. I think when I finally took it down in '97, I was at 8 lines.
What were the users' reaction to this new software?
Well, the users were mostly. I'd say a lot of my users were sysops, even when I was running WWIV, just because I had friends that were sysops, and other sysops would hear about this modified WWIV system, that was multi-user, and so they would log in to check it out. So when I switched to Synchronet, I actually had started developing Synchronet about 6 months or 9 months before I switched to using it, because it didn't have enough features to take down my BBS and start using it. And when I did put it up, there were no file transfers, there were no games. There were a lot of things that I needed to do, but I wanted it to get it testing. I wanted to get it up and going, and at first the reaction was good, because I had added a lot of cool little nifty things, and I think right away I started getting people asking me for copies of the software.
Do you think that it was because they wanted to put up their own version, or do you think it was for other reasons?
Oh no, they definitely wanted to put up their own version. There was at the time we had already started this network called DovNet, which stood for Domain Vertrauen Network. This was with the Beast domain and my BBS, and then there was another BBS called the Midnight Hacker. The sysop was the Zapper. He was actually the first. He was the first person other than myself to run Synchronet.
So, is Synchronet simply wiring into a FidoNet-like network, or is it got its own code?
Well, at the time, Synchronet didn't actually have any networking at first. So DovNet I kind of fell out of DovNet for a while, because I didn't have any networking. DovNet was built on top of WWIV net technology, and I'd never written any WWIV net code, so it didn't have any networking capabilities at first. So DovNet kind of disintegrated. Eventually, all the systems in DovNet switched to Synchronet, but at first, like my BBS and as Midnight Hacker switched to Synchronet, we were out of DovNet because it didn't have any networking technologies. Not long after that, I added QWK support for QWK packets for offline readers. That was internal in the BBS software. And when I started selling it commercially, one of the first sysops that called me and purchased the software was telling me that some other BBS packages use QWK packets for networking. for doing message networking. And that to me seemed very convenient since I already had QWK support in the software, and this was like an open standard, which WWIV network is not. I decided to embrace that and, and extend it and, really get into using QWK as the network technology. So internally, Synchronet supports QWK. It also, not long after that, I wrote a FidoNet tosser as well. So I also did a UTI driver for Postlink, which is what the RelayNet RIME used Postlink technology back then.
What's your memories of World War IV net?
Well, I never really was part. I was never part of World War IV net proper. The only time I used WWIV net technology was when we originally formed DovNet, and it was just a small network of, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 BBSes, and we were all running WWIV. So that's why we used that technology. But we didn't actually join the WWIV, the World War IV net. I still call it WWIV.
Well, why not use it?
Why not use what?
World War IV.
Oh, you mean, the name?
No, why not use World War IV net and be a part of it?
Oh, well, just because we were kind of underground, and that was kind of, joining the mainstream type thing, and we were all running pirated copies of WWIV. None of us had paid for WWIV or the source code. So we certainly didn't want anybody, talking about our modifications to the source code on WWIV net, That'd be kind of a blow it.
Do you think anyone paid for World War IV?
Oh, certainly. Oh, yeah, certainly. I don't know how many or...
I call it WWIV, and I did for a long time. It actually wasn't until I started the documentary that I knew that it stood for World War IV.
Yeah.
It just didn't hit me. To a man, most of the people I talk to call it WIV. Just
Yeah.
WIV.
That's like GIF files.
It's just enough that it confused me.
Yeah.
For a long time, people were like, "Yeah, and I was doing WIV and and I'm like, "WIV? That's where you what?" And they're like, "WIV, World War IV," and it was just like.
Yeah, I had heard someone here and there refer to it as World War IV, and I'm like, that can't be what it stands for. That's just too dumb.
So you were hoping that some other name was going to come out of it.
I had no idea what it stood for, but I just knew it couldn't be World War IV because there had never been a World War III. Why would you jump ahead to World War IV?
Thinking ahead, I'll ask you.
Yeah.
Were there any other, between World War IV and Synchronet, was there any other software you had your eye on that you have memories about?
No, it was a very self-contained world, in this whole 714 area code, and I think every single BBS that was like a pirate BBS was running World War IV. The BBSs that were running like Wildcat or PC board, they were all what we called PD boards, public domain software boards, and they just weren't interesting. So no, I had no interest in. I certainly had no interest in running something that I didn't have the source code to, because by the time I had realized that WWIV had its limitations and that they weren't going to be solved anytime soon by Wayne Bell or anybody else, I knew that I needed the source code to whatever I was going to be working on. And, really I had a strong interest in creating it myself because, I was learning to program and I already knew a lot of the things that were just done so terribly wrong in WWIV that I was anxious to, create something from scratch correctly.
Any thought on why World War IV lagged behind?
Well, I think by that time he had already just kind of piqued his interest. He'd already expended most of his creative energy. I think with most programmers, things, projects come in swells, your interest comes in swells, and certainly while I was running WWIV, nothing really new came out. I think that was like 4.0 1.2 or something like that. I'm trying to remember the version number, but it was around that era, and there was really not much new coming out. But I know later that new things came out, but it still seemed like it was very, very slow.
So you're composing Synchronet, right? Where do you start? What do you planning wise? What do you do?
I really had no plan at the beginning. I didn't have a name, that was for sure. It was just something I did in my spare time, quite a bit at work, because I was at the time I was working at my first computer programming job, and I was programming half the time and kind of doing like network administration the other half the time. There was a lot of downtime, so and I was just kind of getting into my programming skills. So that was when I kind of started dabbling with the idea. So I didn't know in the beginning that what I was writing I was going to continue to maintain or ever even run as a BBS. It was just more like, how would I do this? How would I solve these problems that WWIV had? Had I had it to do all over again. So it was just kind of like, how would you create a database format, file format that's easily recoverable, from like data corruption, for example. So it was just kind of, coming up with those ideas in the beginning. So, I started very, very small. I mean, it was, something that simply, answered a serial connection, and, wrote user data to a user file, and you're able to list the users. I mean, it was, that simple. And just kind of, built from there. And it wasn't until I had a surgery about 6 months later that took me out of work for 2 months. And, when I got home from the hospital, all I did was work on the BBS software. And, after a few weeks of doing that and, and kind of really obsessing heavily on it, that's when I decided I needed to make the switch to run it full time, because that was when I would know where all the problems were in the software and keep me interested in it, test all, the things I'd been working on.
So, do you pull the user interface or any specific details from elsewhere, or is it just, I guess I'm interested.
Yeah.
You initially have a few of the features that you're ultimately going to add, but you got to add more. You got to add a user interface. You got to add a file section. You got to add stuff. And do the ideas come from looking out there and trying to make what's best, or are you just sitting down and trying to recreate from scratch, reinvent the wheel?
Well, no, I definitely didn't try to reinvent the wheel when it came to like the user interface, for an example. Since since World War IV was what I really knew and used, that's pretty much what I mimicked as far as when it came to a user interface. Originally all the commands were mimicked exactly what the current version of World War IV had at the time, or the version that I was running. I was also concerned with switching users over. I didn't want to relearn all new commands, and I certainly didn't want my users to all relearn all new commands. And so initially, all the commands were identical, and they were hard-coded just like WWIV. They weren't something you could change without modifying the source code. That did change over time. But, also, as I'd use it, I had users, actually I had a co-sysop that was very active in it. And he would, ask me, pointed questions like, well, why is it A to auto-reply to an email, but it's not A to auto-reply to posted message, for example, inconsistencies like that. And I'd be like, well, I don't know. That's just the way it is in WWIV. Well, why don't you change that? Why don't you fix that? So, I did make small changes like that, things that were just kind of silly, like the // commands, I changed those kinds of things. So, I wasn't strictly adhering to the WWIV user interface. Over time, I made improvements where I saw them, where it needed improvement. And eventually, Synchronet would support any user interface. WWIV just happened to be, the original inspiration.
So in your opinion, what's the command to end your call to the bots?
My opinion? Well, it depends on what BBS you're calling.
Right,
yeah.
But I meant...
Most of them are G for goodbye. But, since WWIV, used O, and that's what I was used to. I was used to type /O. That's what I use for the default, Synchronet user interface as well.
Okay. Just because that appears to be the command that just seems to have the most legs. There's L for log off, H for hang up, Q for quit,
Yeah,
G for goodbye,
yeah,
and so on.
yeah,
And it just goes on like that.
yeah,
I think there was one with Z,
yeah.
end of the line. So, it's just very interesting why there was such a... So I thought I'd ask different sysops where they got their idea from. So yours was basically World War IV, had that for the interface, and it made sense to follow it.
Yeah, initially, certainly. And some commands still haven't changed in the default Synchronet interface. Many of those are the same. I didn't use like dot for external programs. That didn't make any sense to me. So I used X for external programs. And I think, WWI've used X for like file transfers. And I didn't think that was very obvious. So I used T for transfers or something like that. There was some things that did mutate and change. But no, still it uses O by default. But there are other command shells. When I came out with Synchronet 2.0, it had a programmable scripting language called Baja, and I wrote these clone command shells that basically cloned other BBS packages like Wildcat, PC Board, Major BBS, Renegade, cloned their user interfaces. So I basically stole their menus and made the BBS mimic their commands and look and feel, so that you weren't limited to one look and feel, and the user could choose which interface they were most familiar with or wanted to use.
Did you get positive feedback for that? That's essentially skins.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That was one of my I think it was one of the most frequently asked questions in version 1 was how do I change the the log off command to G, for example, and I certainly didn't want to release another version where the log off command was G. And at one point I had it where, each command was mapped to a letter and the user could actually choose what letter that wanted to be mapped to. And there might have even been a version released or two that used that type of customization where the user could actually choose, I want to use A for log off. But there was no way to make that nicely map with menus that displayed, and it certainly didn't create anything that was intuitive for the user. So that's when the idea of the scripting language and actually mimic not just the commands but the actual menu structure, because not all BBSs have the same menu structure. Some have a one main menu where you can do messaging and everything, or some of them have them broken up into message file transfers and different subsections like that.
Was there any, did you try to compare and download and look at other pieces of BBS software to get ideas?
Later. Initially, I was very close-minded, with Synchronet, and I pretty much thought I, knew all there was. But when I started selling it commercially, I was getting phone calls from all these people responding to our ads in Boardwatch Magazine and BBS Callers Digest. And, they were asking for things like Digiboard support and FidoNet and things I had absolutely no experience with or personal interest in. Mm-hmm. But since people seemed to be pretty persistent and really had no interest in my software if it didn't support FidoNet, for example, I really had no choice but to research those technologies and research the BBSs that supported them and, integrate those technologies into Synchronet.
Is there any BBS program you bump into and you just can't believe this is a distributed BBS program?
Well, certain aspects of any BBS program. I mean, I'd even include Synchronet in that there's, aspects where you go, oh, well, this was a mistake. That was a design flaw that shouldn't have made it. But, I think every BBS has its downside, and every BBS software has its pluses and minuses, there's assets and deficits to all of them.
Was there a feature, besides obviously the skins, that you added that you said, nobody else has this, we've got it, we rock?
Well, there were several, actually. I mean, what you call skins, I called command shells. But yeah, there were a lot of features like that. Do you mind if she's up here, or should I? Okay.
Okay.
This is Gidget.
It's just amusing to have cats around.
Okay.
As long as we can hear you.
All right.
Other features?
Yeah. There were several. The same sysop that asked me about QWK networking also mentioned RIP technology. He had gone to, I guess, BBS Con in '92 and ran into the guys that were developing RIP, which were actually very close to me. They were local here in Orange County. But he said emphatically, "This is the future, and you got to do this." And I was like, "Well, okay, So I contacted the guys that were doing RIP script, and and they said this is great, because no BBS software ships with internal support for RIP script. So they actually helped me. They created the menus, and and I read their spec and put the support into the software and shipped a version with menus, with stock menus. In I believe it was early in '93, and that was before Searchlight came out with their RIP script support. So we were the first. We certainly we weren't the best. Searchlight came out, like a few months later, I think, with their RIP script support, and they went to a lot greater lengths to embrace the RIP technology and do, a lot more integration in the BBS, and took it a lot more seriously than we did. But we were the first.
Well, looking back, what do you think RIP script's place in history is?
Well, now it's a sad demise of a technology. I think it'd been floundering and dead for quite a while, but the fact that it ended up in the hands of someone who's extremely bitter towards BBS people and sysops in particular was very sad.
Oh, you know of that?
Huh?
You know of that?
Oh yeah. I talked to Pat Clausen on occasion, and he called me several times when Digital Dynamics was still selling Synchronet, and that was the name of the software company that I had, and and he would kind of try to like rally support from me or something, and I was very supportive. I said, yeah, I'm very supportive of RIP script. Why wouldn't I be? I also supported WIP. That was a competing standard for a good 6 months, and I had no reason not to be. But he was kind of a strange character. He was very marketing oriented. I think he had some background with CNN or something in broadcast media.
In my phone conversation with him, which will hopefully be followed by an interview at some point, he definitely hated sysops, and he definitely thought that given if they hadn't rejected it, RIP script would have saved the BBS industry.
Oh. Well, I don't think sysops rejected RIP script. I think it actually, in a way, it was one of the major success stories, of the mid '90s or the early '90s. It just with a lot of things with BBS technology, it came too late. By the time, it came too late and it was proprietary. And these are two things that HTML had going for it. If RIP had come out, a couple years maybe before HTML, and it had been distributed over TCP/IP, it might have been the HTML that we all know and use today. Mm-hmm. But it really, it's not a markup language. It's not really as flexible as HTML. But it also doesn't quite serve exactly the same purpose. But that's really what killed RIP, was HTML.
Now, a subculture, a group of kids, start creating art in RIP script, mm-hmm. and trade it, and they continue to use it as a medium today.
Yeah.
Is that unexpected?
It doesn't surprise me too much. RIP is just another graphic. It's another vector graphic format, and they had pretty decent development tools, being that they were DOS tools. I had a friend that was an artist, and I encouraged him to check out their paint program, and he did a set of artwork in RIP paint, and they were very impressive. And they were actually used in some of the telegraphics printed ads. And there's still a pack going around of his. It's called DWM RIP or something like that, or RIP DWM art, something like that. But it's got DWM in the file name. Anyway, it's David Wayne McNeil, and he was an artist. And we managed to squeeze Synchronet into a couple of those RIP art screens. But they're very detailed, and I'm not surprised that people still use it and still use it as a file format. It's kind of obscure. And you have to use these proprietary viewers for them. I think they have a web plugin, or they did at one time.
Yes,
for web browser. Yeah. If you can find their website.
Let me just check the time on the thing. Let's see. I didn't pay much attention to Synchronet because by the time you really start developing it, I'm out. So I don't have any context. Would you say you're pretty popular? Where would you put yourself in the scope of the BBS industry? The board watch driven BBS four-color industry.
Yeah, but I mean, there is no board watch driven industry today. It's
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying during your heyday.
Okay, during my heyday, what I would say is my claim to fame. I mean, we had, and I can show you, we had full-page ads in Boardwatch and BBS Scholars Digest magazines, and even other magazines for periods of time, like Online Access and BBS SysOp News, the magazine type. Later was Cyber World Report or something. So we did a lot of advertising, and I sold about 2,000 copies of Synchronet. So I think that's pretty good. Definitely successful. I mean, it managed to sustain me and a few employees for, at least 2 or 3 years. So, it was successful. It was a little bit late. I think, had I come out, 4 or 5 years earlier, the name would certainly have been known a lot more, and there would be a lot fewer people running WWIV or these other BBS packages at the time. But now, today, it's totally different. I mean, I think I have a huge market share, because it's free, and there, not too many people are paying for BBS software these days. And of those people that are running BBSes, they want something that's being actively developed, shows that it has a future. And Synchronet is one of the few of those today that has that. Plus, it's open source. It's multi-platform. You got versions for Linux, FreeBSD, and Win32. And I actively support it, and so it also has the benefit of the background of being a commercial package. So it has serious documentation and a lot of the attention to detail that wouldn't be given a non-commercial BBS package. Even though it's not commercial today, it still has those has a lot of the benefits of once being a commercial.
Yeah, foundation is what you're saying. It's built to sell, but it's being given away.
Right. Originally it was. Yeah. Or not even originally. Actually, originally it was not built to sell at all. I didn't want to sell Synchronet at all at first. It was certainly not a commercial venture.
What changes your mind?
Well, there was sysops that were, begging me to give me money. For mainly they wanted the source code. So I said, okay, $200 I'll give you the source code. $100 I'll give you an executable. And I sold my first copy to a guy named Dream Master. There's a couple Dream Masters now, but he's still around. And that kind of started the chain rolling. Once there was someone else running, I can get a copy of Synchronet, if I pay $100. So, and then my brother called me and he said, "Hey, I found this magazine. They're totally advertising BBS software and everything." And I was like, "What?" I couldn't believe there's a magazine about BBSs. Well, it turns out there was two, the Boardwatch and BBS Scholars Digest. So he said, "Well, how about this? I'll write up an ad. I'll make an ad, and we'll run it, and let's see if we can sell some copies of Synchronet." I wasn't employed at the time, so I borrowed some money from him. He paid for the ads, and that's what we did. That's what started the whole thing.
How much did the ads cost? Do you remember?
At first, they were pretty cheap. I think it was like $350 for one per month. This is for full page black and white, and the other one was like $500. And after a couple years, they tripled in price.
Popularity?
No. I mean, I wasn't selling more copies 3 years later. And they weren't selling more copies of their magazine. I think they just realized that they could gouge, and I think they were trying to, stay profitable, just like the BBSes and the BBS software companies were. And since they weren't selling more subscriptions, they decided to raise their advertising price.
Was that indicative in other aspects of the magazine as well? Did some things go away or become more expensive or otherwise diminish as funds were, more and more of a priority?
I didn't really get a whole lot of support from the magazines. I think since Synchronet was kind of a latecomer, uh, it was already kind of an established old boys school of TBBS and PC Board and Wildcat and Major BBS. Those were the four mainstays, and those are the guys that they all seemed to, if they didn't really necessarily like each other, they all knew each other and respected each other as established companies. And here I come in, and I think Searchlight maybe too was kind of in that same crowd. But here Synchronet comes in, and I posted our ads were very bold. They had comparisons feature by feature. Do you have this? Do you have this? And obviously it was very skewed towards Synchronet. Maybe particularly obscure feature, but it was another bullet item that we could say we have, and Wildcat doesn't, and PC Board doesn't, and TBBS doesn't, and Major BBS doesn't, and then we put the price, and we were like a fourth of their price, and that was our kind of advertising, and they hated us for it.
Do you think that was a good deal? I mean, do you think you were fair and sold a good price?
Oh, absolutely. It was extremely competitive, and I think the quality of the software for the price was a great deal. I don't get any. I still get emails from people that bought the software back then. They get it for free now, and they all are very appreciative of the fact that they were able to buy it back then, and very happy that they supported Synchronet at a time when it was a commercial package.
For the Boardwatch experience, the experience of dealing with Boardwatch, I take it you just mailed in your ads and.
Yeah, we had a very much arm's length relationship with Boardwatch, and they ran that BBS convention, one BBS con, and it was, I think, in '93, and it was in Colorado Springs, and we paid our $5,000 or whatever it was to get in there, and my brother and I and a couple of my friends that were working with me or helping me with the Synchronet project at the time, and we invested some money, built a booth, and had this huge blimp, blow up blimp. It's like 12 foot, Synchronet painted on the side and everything. And, didn't get a whole lot of interest at the show, but one thing we did was we announced an OS2 version. We had signs with an OS2 version. And, John Dvorak was interested in that, John C. Dvorak. So he came by and talked with us, and, IBM had a booth there, so we had kind of some support from IBM, because we were the only company commercial BBS software company that was releasing an OS2 version. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of our niche at the show. But the blimp, you couldn't stand anywhere in that convention hall and not see our blimp. It was an original idea. It was a great idea. It looked great. Somehow yet, when the Boardwatch magazine came out that covered the show, there was not a single picture of our booth and not a single picture where you could see our blimp. Now, they had to try hard to avoid getting the picture of our blimp in any of the pictures, because you couldn't stand anywhere in the hall and not see the blimp. Yet somehow they managed to take pictures, constantly avoiding our booth. And there was no mention of us, anywhere in the article. Only the four big boys, telegraphics over RIP. And interesting, like a month or two later, a sysop wrote in and said, hey, I know that Digital Dynamics was at your show, but yet you didn't make any mention of them in your one BBS con article. And Jack Rickard, he responded. He said, oh, yeah, I went to their booth and, nobody would talk to me or something, or they kind of ignored me, so I didn't really talk to them, and, that kind of thing. And so basically he was saying, we blew them off. So, they came to our booth to photograph and interview us, but we blew them off. Well, the fact is that I was at that booth every single day. I did not leave, and I know what Jack Rickard looks like, and he never came by.
So what do you think was the story?
Well, the story was that they had no interest in promoting Synchronet or our company, and they were in bed with, the guys from TBBS and eSoft and what's his name, the eSoft guy.
Phil Becker?
Yeah, Phil Becker. If he and Phil Becker, like owned each other's companies or something, and they did this whole one BBS con together, TBBS, their software, they had the opening spread in Boardwatch magazine had a comparison, some bullshit comparison of TBBS with like Wildcat and PC Board and Synchronet. They compared us they compared themselves like three softwares, right? And we were the one of them, And they made up some number like we can only run 4 nodes on a computer or some BS like that. And they could run, 10 or 20 or whatever they made up, whatever number they made up. But they obviously had something against us. So the fact that they did and they're in bed with Jack Rickard means that, they're not going to do anything to help promote our software. So, there was some conflict of interest there for sure.
Did you notice any other software getting short shrift?
Yeah, I think most of the smaller guys got short shrift. I think Searchlight to a large degree, and the Robo FX guy was there, and he had a very impressive display. I mean, what he was showing looked a lot better than RIP. His software, was a lot what we expect today from using a web browser, and he didn't get hardly any coverage.
So why do you think all that is the case?
Well, I just think there was a conflict of interest. I think the people that are writing the articles are the same people that are best friends with or own part of the competition.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going to give a fair share to each company. It was unethical.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically a huge waste of money. So I'm a little bit bitter over it, but it was all business expense. I mean, it's just like another form of advertising was doing the show. But really, what miffed me was when he wrote in his editor column in response to that sysop that was inquiring about the lack of Synchronet coverage, basically a total lie,
Mm-hmm.
Saying that we ignored them, and that's completely untrue.
Do you think? Did you end up going to the next BBS Con?
No.
Or any of the next?
No, I was no. The BBS magazine had their own convention like a couple years later called BBS Expo, and I think it was 94 or 95, and they invited me and just to come as an individual and speak or something, and I didn't go, and they were supposed to have supposedly they were going to have Al Gore, the inventor of the internet, as a spokesman, but of course he didn't make it either, so I don't feel too bad.
Tell people it was the two of you were together off doing something.
Right. We couldn't make it. Yeah.
Did it hurt your stuff? Did your, in other words, obviously you came away from BBS Con with a less than positive experience. Do you feel it hurt the business in any way? Like, do you think that energy that you were wasting on that could have been used elsewhere, or do you think that you were going along pretty fine and you tried to go further and it just didn't work this way?
I don't have any regrets about it. I don't know whether we wasted assets or time or money or whatever on it. We probably did, but I met a lot of sysops and people that were using my software and got a lot of ideas, things I wouldn't implement for years and years. But still, I had people come out to me asking me, hey, does your software do this or that? And I didn't realize at the time, but they were way ahead of the game.
What's a good example of a feature like that?
Oh, like I remember one sysop coming up to me and asking me, hey, if I get a TCP/IP connection into your BBS from a specific IP address, will it automatically recognize me and log me in? And I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? I had no interest in Telnet or any other TCP/IP protocols. Of course, Synchronet today does have an auto login by IP address feature, but that's 8-9 years later.
Mm-hmm. I think we're just about off this tape. Yeah, we are. Good. So that's the first tape.
Okay.
As you can see, take a break for one water. Whew. Boy, am I fading. But I'm getting questions out. So if you see my eyes flutter, that's me.
Do you want
insane amount. And it's usually 46 grams, and it's 2 servings per can. You know, and you're just